Forget everything you thought you knew about history. This is history and its stories, where we rip open the textbooks and dive headfirst into the raw, unfiltered sagas of human experience. Prepare to be amazed, shocked, and utterly captivated. Our journey into the past starts now. The Ghost Ship. Myth of the Mary Celeste. Imagine sailing on the open ocean and suddenly spotting a huge ship. Silent, completely deserted, but everything on board is in its place. Is this possible? What if an entire ship's crew disappeared in the blink of an eye, leaving behind unsolved mysteries that persist to this day? When we use abandoned as an adjective for anything, the human mind automatically conjures up an imaginary scene or assumes a mysterious deserted house. What is the reality of the word? Although one could choose other synonyms, one would not feel the same. For example, an uninhabited house. Yet the result is the same in both cases, an uninhabited house. However, the word abandoned conveys a stronger, linguistically significant meaning. The choice of the passive voice to describe it indicates that we don't know who abandoned it or why, a meaning that conveys a strong impression that the place is dark, neglected, and contaminated. Any abandoned place immediately triggers fear in one's mind because we fear the unknown. Imagine, for example, a car parked in front of your house that you've never seen before, that's been there for months, dirty, with flat tires. The sun and accumulated dust on the car's paint make it impossible to identify its original color. Then you ask yourself, who owns it, and why did they leave it here for so long? And the more dangerous question, what could have happened to them? The more you think about it and fail to find answers to these questions, the more imaginative the subject becomes.
In December 1872, the Canadian ship Dei Gratia was en route to the port of Gibraltar, a port in southern Spain. The weather was cold, the ocean, fortunately, calm, but visibility was poor. The ship was nearing the end of its voyage. In a few days, they would see the coast of Portugal ahead. The captain heard one of his crew members call out to him and point towards the horizon. Captain Morehouse squinted in the direction the man indicated and, through the fog, began to make out the general outer shape of a vessel. It was not unusual for someone like Captain Morehouse, who had spent his entire life at sea, to encounter another vessel during a voyage. But as soon as Captain Morehouse looked through his telescope, he noticed something abnormal. The ship had almost all its sails furled, even though the wind was favorable. It was listing noticeably to one side. He continued to watch the strange ship turn until he was sure it was moving in wide circles around itself. He tried to send a signal to the ship, but there was no response. Finally, he decided to send 2 of his crew members in a boat to the strange ship to ensure it wasn't suffering from a potential defect. And indeed, they got into the boat and headed for the mysterious vessel. There were no signs of a defect in the ship's hull, but the more they searched, the stranger it became. The storerooms were full of food. The sailors' belongings were still in the cabins. They turned the ship upside down until they came to a definite conclusion. This ship was sailing by itself. There was no living creature aboard. There were no signs of a struggle, no signs that lifeboats had been launched from it. It was as if this ship had left port of its own free will and sailed into the ocean, or as if the entire crew had vanished
in an instant, without a trace. The Mary Celeste, an enigmatic story. To this day, it's not precisely known what happened aboard the Mary Celeste. There was no indication of a problem, a crisis, a weather or health disaster, or even a defect in the ship's hull that would have prompted the entire crew to abandon it in such a mysterious manner. In attempts to understand what occurred, the ship's history was investigated. When was it built? What were its specifications? And what was the reason for its construction? But even this investigation leads to nothing more than the fact that this ship had bad luck from the very beginning. The ship was not named Mary Celeste. It was named Amazon when it was built. It was a commercial sailing schooner whose construction began in 1860 by a Canadian businessman named Joshua Dewis. The ship's form was simple, though not without beauty. It was also not a passenger ship. Its purpose was purely commercial. Profits and cost reduction were paramount. It was designed to be able to sail with the smallest possible number of crew members. The cabin space was very small compared to the cargo hold. Construction was completed in 1861, and only the captain was missing. Dewis asked one of the ship's owners or someone involved in its construction to command this ship. The man's name was Macalin. He had very good sea experience, and being one of the owners was also reassuring. He wouldn't play games or waste time, and would ensure the safety of every step and its swift execution. But before the ship embarked on its first voyage, the new captain caught a cold. He was still insistent that there were no problems, and that it was just a cold that would pass. However, while the ship was already being loaded in port, this simple cold quickly turned into pneumonia, ending in record time with the death of Macalin, who is considered the first victim of the cursed ship, the Mary Celeste. The Odyssey of the Amazon, a series of misfortunes for businessman Joshua Dewis. There was no time for mourning or feigned sorrow. Like any businessman, he was bound by obligations to the investors who had put their money into building this ship, and profits needed to start flowing quickly. He managed to find a new captain for the ship named John Parker, and fortunately the ship was indeed able to embark on its first voyage. But quickly, and even before the ship progressed further on its journey, its hull was damaged due to colliding with a series of fishing weirs that fishermen build in certain areas. The ship had not yet reached the open sea and was incapacitated once again. It had to return to port to spend days on repairs. These days passed, and the ship was about to set out on its journey into the open sea after most of the crew, the captain, and even the investors had begun to doubt whether this ship was even destined to operate. But it reached London after a difficult voyage and a struggle with harsh weather conditions. It still had another stop before beginning its return journey. It had to go to Lisbon. However, on its voyage from London to Lisbon, the unlucky ship collided with another smaller vessel. The small ship sank immediately, and the Mary Celeste, which was still called Amazon at the time, did not sink. But the accident, of course, caused severe damage to the ship's hull, and once again it had to dock for weeks until it was repaired and could complete its return journey. For 2 years thereafter, things seemed stable, and the ship had somewhat abandoned its annoying habit of being damaged or getting into easily avoidable accidents. But it was only 2 years, after which much repeated itself, and until 1869, the ship would collide with a rocky wall, suffer severe damage during storms, or the captain would simply decide he no longer wanted to work on this ship. The ship's owners couldn't make a profit before finding themselves forced once again to spend on repairs or delay its departure until they found a new captain. Over time, it began to seem that this project, or this specific ship, was a mistaken idea from the start. An unprofitable project, something always went wrong, and no one could do anything to prevent it. In 1869, they finally decided to put the unlucky ship, Amazon, up for public auction, and the ship was sold to an American company named J.H. Winchester. The company decided to change the ship's name from Amazon to Mary Celeste. And it seems their luck was a little better, as the ship operated for another 2 years without notable problems. However, all the previous repairs and problems the ship had endured since its construction began to show. The company decided, well, we will cease operations and carry out a complete overhaul of the ship at a cost exceeding $10,000, or the equivalent of $300,000 in today's terms. When the work on the ship was completed, its appearance had almost changed. Larger storage space and the crew quarters also became larger and more numerous. The ship could now carry a larger cargo and thus more profits. All previously occurring problems were fixed. As usual, only the captain remained. The captain who did not know, nor did the company know, that he would be the first and last captain of the Mary Celeste.
The Mary Celeste's final voyage. Benjamin Briggs was 37 years old when he set sail with the ship. He was married and a father of a school-aged son and a 2-year-old daughter. A captain, son of a captain, son of a captain. Briggs came from a family with a long history at sea. Therefore, he knew very well that life at sea, despite its allure, was not without risks. And he knew the ship's history well, and how many unusual problems this particular ship had encountered. But given his long experience, both at sea and due to belonging to a family of sailors, he was not the type to surrender to fate. Benjamin had seen a great deal and lost many people, the last of whom was his younger brother, who died during a sea voyage in 1870. At that time, Benjamin Briggs had reached a point of complete saturation. He was tired of the long voyages from which he returned to find his son growing up, and was surprised that the boy didn't even remember what he looked like. But the offer he received to be captain of the Mary Celeste was tempting. It was a very financially rewarding offer. The offer he received was that if he agreed to be captain of the ship, he would own 1/3 of the entire ship. He saw this as something that would eventually give him the luxury of early retirement, so he pushed himself a little. Furthermore, the modifications to the ship had expanded the captain's cabin, allowing him to take his wife and daughter on his voyages. What happened with his son would not be repeated, at least not with his daughter. Perhaps this wasn't the best available choice for his wife, but for her it was also much better than the long periods she had to spend alone without her husband. The ship was now ready for service, and Benjamin, fortunately, managed to secure a contract to transport a cargo of industrial alcohol from New York to Italy. He would take his wife and the little girl. Their son, Arthur, was in school at the time and couldn't miss months of education, so they decided to leave him in the care of his grandmother until they returned from the voyage. The ship finished loading on November 7th, 1872. The ship was finally ready for its first voyage after being completely refitted. All the details known afterward came from the logbook which the ship's captain had to keep, recording the voyage with all its details. This is like the black box in modern aircraft now. And from the captain's notes, the journey was not easy from the beginning. A very short time after the ship left New York Harbor, the weather changed. The winds intensified, and the waves rose ominously, to the point that the captain decided to return to port and wait for the storm to pass. And it seemed to be a wise decision because for days thereafter, visibility was impossible. After the storm passed safely, the ship finally sailed into the Atlantic Ocean, with the captain, his wife, the little girl, and the small crew on board. A cargo consisting of 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol heading for the port of Genoa in Italy. But the problem was that as soon as they moved away from the coasts of the United States, the winds intensified again.
The captain states in his logbook that for 3 weeks the ship sailed in incessant rain and raging waves. The ship's crew was exhausted and completely drained. At the end of the 3rd week, on November 24th, the weather began to improve. On November 25, there were no observations regarding the weather or anything strange. Just simple observations about the distribution of tasks and the general atmosphere of the voyage, and an estimated time of arrival. And then, nothing. The ship captain notes for November 25 were the last entry in the logbook. The mystery of the abandoned Mary Celeste. On December 4th, 1872, the Mary Celeste was found completely devoid of life. She was discovered by Captain Morehouse, who commanded the merchant ship Dei Gratia. The ship was circling with no signs of life or that any living person had ever been on board. He sent 2 of his crew members to explore the ship, and after he himself entered to verify what they had said, he was unable to understand exactly or even imagine what had happened. What would make an entire ship's crew disappear like that? Why were all their belongings left as they were? Why did even the ship's captain not attempt to write a single sentence or note about anything strange or a violent event or anything they might have experienced that caused them to abandon the ship so quickly? And stranger still, why were there no indications that lifeboats had been lowered from the ship? An unusual number of questions forced him to completely stop trying to answer. The decision was to leave a limited group of his crew on the Mary Celeste and try to bring the ship back to the nearest port. Yet all the while, despite his attempts, the questions haunted him. Why, when they left the ship, did no one even attempt the most important routine step, which is to lash the helm to ensure the waves wouldn't push the ship in random directions?
And the image that never left his imagination was the captain's cabin.
A dress, carelessly thrown on the bed, clearly belonging to the captain's wife, and on the bed, a small indentation where a sleeping body had been. The body of a child. The child had just vanished from its place moments before they entered the ship. On December 13, 1872, the Mary Celeste finally reached the port of the Spanish city of Gibraltar.
Theories and speculations about the Mary Celeste. In the years that followed, researchers and investigators of the extremely strange incident continued to try and reach any conclusion that could close this case. The simplest theory was that the captain quickly ordered the crew to evacuate the ship out of fear of something. What was this something? That in itself is the subject of other theories. Not a single one of them provides answers to all the questions, as there was no evidence that the ship was sinking or even threatened with sinking. The Spanish investigators had a different theory. When the ship arrived, they initially refused to pay the reward, which was supposed to be substantial, to the crew of the Dei Gratia, considering them the ones who rescued the Mary Celeste. This was a customary practice, and the size of the reward was also proportionate to the ship's cargo. What aroused suspicion in the investigators' minds was that there is no such thing as a completely sound ship with no problems whatsoever being left in such a manner, without any logical justification. And add to that the ship's very valuable cargo. This immediately pointed fingers at the Dei Gratia's crew. Is it logical that they would coincidentally find an empty ship in the ocean, and coincidentally, this empty ship would be loaded with such cargo? And imagining the rest was easy. The Dei Gratia intercepted the Mary Celeste, disposed of the crew and the captain and his family, and took the ship to the nearest port to claim the reward. The crew of the Dei Gratia were interrogated one by one, and each was asked about the most precise details of what had happened. The time the
condition of the ship, and even the state of the sea and the weather at the time they encountered the Mary Celeste. The goal of all these questions, which lasted for days, was to find any contradiction between the stories, or a gap in a detail that one of them might mention incorrectly. Of course, this is very likely if they were lying, such as if someone mentioned a detail or recounted it differently. But for days the investigators failed to find any incriminating evidence against any member of the De Gratia's crew. All the stories were identical, and it's impossible that they all fabricated a story and memorized it with such brilliance.
The most frightening theory, the cargo as the cause. The second theory was that the ship had been attacked by pirates. As mentioned, there's no evidence that lifeboats were launched from the ship, so the crew didn't leave the ship willingly. But this theory had two problems. First, decades before, the phenomenon of piracy in the Atlantic Ocean had probably completely ended. Sea pirates at that time belonged only in historical and fictional novels, and perhaps yellow journalism articles, nothing more. But the more important point is that all the belongings of the crew and the captain, some of which were actually valuable, were in place, and the ship's cargo was as is. Well, what was the purpose of piracy? What did they achieve by attacking this ship? Consequently, this theory explained nothing at all. The last theory, which for me personally is the most terrifying among them, is that the ship's crew was actually forced to leave the ship because of its cargo. From the details found on the ship, it was apparent that 7 barrels of industrial alcohol were empty. This alcohol is not potable and is used only in industries, and its smell can be very strong.
One theory suggests that alcohol leaked from these barrels, and that the very disturbing smell of alcohol made it impossible for the crew to remain on deck. The captain's idea was to get into one of the lifeboats, despite no evidence of boats being lowered, and wait at sea beside the ship until the smell dissipated and the alcohol evaporated. But the sea became rougher afterward, and the boat couldn't stay alongside the ship. The ship drifted away, and the crew, the captain, his wife and his daughter in the boat, watched the ship with all their belongings and all the food and drink, powerless to do anything, and knowing full well that from then on they were at the mercy of the ocean and its waves. And this theory also doesn't explain everything, but it is perhaps the closest to reality. See, of the ghost ship, to this day, it's not precisely known what happened, and there is no single explanation that answers everything. And this, as usual, leads to answers and theories taking a metaphysical turn over time. The eternal problem is that when explanation becomes difficult, it becomes very easy for people to start talking about the kraken, or the deep sea monster, or the giant octopus that kidnapped the ship's passengers, and about aliens, and about ghosts that drove them to madness. And most likely, what happened had a logical explanation, or at least it was logical at the time for the passengers of the Mary Celeste, which caused them to abandon it. The Mary Celeste thereafter became known as the ghost ship, the story of a ship discovering another, completely empty vessel, even though everything on board is intact and in its place, is very stimulating to the imagination. And anything that has no clear explanation often pushes the mind in frightening directions. In 2002, the horror film Ghost Ship was released, and although the name is directly inspired by the Mary Celeste, the plot and time are different from those of the Mary Celeste, but the film's influence from the story was clear. When I watched the film at that time, it wasn't very scary. That is, it was merely entertaining. But now, when I imagine that this film is based on or influenced by real events, I feel that the matter is much more terrifying. We will probably never know exactly what happened aboard the Mary Celeste. All that humanity can offer are theories and retrospective analyses, but as usual, nothing is certain.
From ancient empires to modern revolutions, every story we tell on History and its Stories shapes our present and future. Don't let these incredible tales fade away. If you loved this exploration, smash that like button, become a part of our history-loving community by subscribing, and tell us what's the one historical event you wish you could have witnessed. Until our next adventure, keep the past alive.